So Josh, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me on the program, Jesse.
So you wrote an extensive blog post about the charter schools provision in Senate Bill 451. Can you give me sort of your main points in your argument that it is most likely unconstitutional?
Sure. It's no secret that the charter provision in SB 451, model legislation that was drafted by ALEC, which is a conservative-leaning organization, that's not at all unusual or problematic, maybe in other states. But that template was not tailored to the West Virginia Constitution. On its face, SB 451, and even the House version, committee version, disregards Article 12, Section 10, which requires a majority vote of majority voters in a county to approve the creation of any new independent free school district or organization. And the omnibus bill defines charter schools in a way that makes them free and independent school organizations. In fact, that's the whole point of a charter school, right? So that they would be free, yet independent from what their supporters perceive to be excessive regulations that are imposed on public schools. So if the legislature wants to create charter schools, it can do so provided that, again, the majority of voters in that county approve it.
So that's your main argument.
That's my main argument.
The first one. What are your other two arguments?
So the second argument that I think is problematic on the face of this bill is that it disregards another provision of the Constitution, Article 12, Section 2, which vests the power to supervise public schools in the State Board of Education. Now, under the charter school bill that's currently in its current form, charters would be supervised by themselves primarily, but also by their authorizers and a 7-member public charter school commission. So what's the problem with that? Two problems. Number one, there's a line of West Virginia Supreme Court precedent, including a unanimous 2017 case, that prohibits the legislature from interfering with the State Board of Education's supervision of public schools. Now, the Public Charter School Commission would still fall under the supervision of the State Board, but by my reading of that Supreme Court precedent, that would still constitute interference. In fact, in the 2017 case, what the legislature did was effectively delegate the authority to decide about consolidation of schools to county boards of education. And the court said that duty could not be delegated, that it was the State Board of Education's power to do that. The second reason I think that's problematic is because the state of West Virginia obligated itself in court proceedings in 1982 that it would implement a master plan for public education. Now there's a long history here, but the short of it is this. 40 years ago, this month, the West Virginia Supreme Court issued a landmark decision, Pauley versus Kelly, that recognized children's fundamental right to an adequate and equitable education. That decision, the Supreme Court eventually remanded that case back to a trial court, Judge Arthur Reck, and Judge Reck issued an order which would become known as simply the Reck decision, which would further spell out what adequate and equitable education was. To resolve that case, the state agreed that it would develop and be bound by a master plan. Well, the state never implemented that plan, and subsequent litigation prompted the legislature in 1997 to enact a statute that Judge Reck decided that would implement the master plan finally. And Judge Reck decided he would terminate the jurisdiction and let the state try to fulfill that. That statute also recognizes that it's the State Board of Education and the state superintendent that has the authority to implement that master plan. So this constitutional obligation to provide an adequate and equitable education and to supervise the implementation of that can't be delegated to non-constitutional actors, authorizers, or public school charter commissions. And in what we've seen in other states where charter schools have been challenged and those constitutional challenges have been upheld, is that there are unique provisions in state constitutions, as in Colorado, for example, that would vest supervisory powers in state boards of education that can't be usurped by the legislature. So that's another problem. The third problem doesn't present itself on the face of the statute, but it could be problematic depending on how these charter schools are implemented. So the bill requires that county boards of education will pay 90% of their funding from levy taxes and their state aid for each student that is enrolled in a charter school. They'll transfer that 90% to the charter schools. The West Virginia Department of Education says that's going to drain public schools of funding, and here's why. Traditional public schools have certain fixed costs, fixed operating costs that are unlikely to change if a small minority of their students decide to enroll in charter schools. The loss of those students to charters would not be significant enough to allow the school district to downsize teachers or staff, right? And anyway, we'd still have to pay the same cost to keep the lights on, the heat on, the school buses running. All those costs are fixed for them. They're not fixed for the charter schools. So for example, if you have to send $10,000 per student to the charter school, and let's say there's 50 students in your county that want to enroll in that charter school, the school board would have to, or the school district would be operating with the same cost they had the year before, but with $50,000 less. Now, some counties would be able to absorb that loss of revenue because they could raise taxes, and this bill allows them to raise it at higher rates. But there are poverty poor and sparsely populated counties that would not be able to raise taxes to absorb those losses. That would create a disparity between counties and students.
So the word that you mentioned before was equitable, and so that would interfere with that.
That's right, because we have a fundamental right to education in this state, entitles us to the highest degree of judicial scrutiny, meaning that the bill would be unconstitutional unless it was absolutely necessary to create charter schools to serve a compelling government interest. Now, whatever the commendable goals of charter schools are, it's arguable that it would be necessary to create charter schools to achieve them, right? That the public schools cannot achieve those results. Moreover, I think the main problem is that these goals that are listed in the bill for charter schools do not outweigh the state's commitment to equality of educational opportunity for all children.
So this is sort of a conflict between a cut and copy version of some legislation running into the specific provisions in our own state constitution as upheld through pretty defined case law, it looks like.
Case law going back 40 years or more.
Well, and I should also mention that the bill's going through some changes in the House. There's a public hearing on Monday as well, so we could see some more changes. But let's assume for a second that there aren't substantial changes to the charter schools provision, and this gets pushed through. What's the remedy for lawmakers as they look at this bill? If they want this bill to pass constitutional muster when it either switches houses or as the governor contemplates his own approval or disapproval of the bill, what's the way forward for lawmakers who would like to see charter schools happen in the state?
Yeah, well, there's one easy fix, and the easy fix is they could include a provision in the bill that says that majority of voters in each county has to decide whether they want to create charter schools. And that's an easy fix. And that would avoid a constitutional challenge. And so the question is, why wouldn't you do that unless you are worried that voters would reject that provision? With respect to the supervision, I suppose you could get rid of the intermediate levels of supervision. So you could get rid of the commission and just have the state board monitor and supervise directly the charter schools. Of course, that sort of then takes away from the independence of the charter schools. And that's the whole, sort of the reason that they want to exist in the first place, is to be independent of state boards. So I'm not sure that anyone would want to make that particular fix, but that is something you could do that would be consistent with the Constitution. With respect to the draining of resources, the state could always commit more resources, right? To compensate for any inequities or disparities that are created as a result of this measure. Moreover, the state really needs to think about ways that it can adequately fund schools, regardless of the disparities.
So any constitutional challenge would end up at the state Supreme Court, who would consider it. Our state Supreme Court has gone through quite a few changes in the past year. Mm-hmm. Do you think the makeup of the current court would have any bearing on a constitutional challenge?
It, of course, could. I think most judges try to be objective, try to apply the law in an objective way. They all have their own ideologies, their own political preferences that they bring into that job. But for the most part, in many cases, they do that in a neutral fashion, and they do the best that they can to be objective. In the really close cases, that's where the ideology really shapes the outcome of the decision. But I don't think this is a close case. I think that this is plain on its face unconstitutional without voter approval. I think it's plain on its face unconstitutional given the line of court precedent that you can't interfere with the supervisory powers of the state board. So one would hope that no matter the political affiliation of the judges and the current composition of the court, that they would apply the law. To do so otherwise, to go back and to overturn 40 years of precedent, going all the way back to Pauley versus Kelly, I think would be disastrous. And I think it would erode the integrity of the court. So for conservative judges, they profess that they want to adhere to the plain text of the Constitution or to the original meaning of the Constitution, right? And I think that the history is relevant here. Charles Ambler, who was the leading authority of the history of education in West Virginia, observed that the changes that were made in that 1872 Constitution, that included Section 10, that required voter approval, were the product of experience and a desire to extend the benefits of education to the whole state instead of a select few. And I find a bit of irony in the history when you consider this particular charter school bill.
Well, Josh, I really appreciate your time, and I thank you for joining us.
Thank you again for having me.